Thank you, John. I want to thank Speaker Johnson as well, particularly for inviting the Gold Star families today for a presentation of the Congressional Gold Medal on behalf of their children who were blasted by a suicide bomber that came out of Bagram prison, and it didn't have to happen. But I want to thank you, sir, for honoring their sacrifice and those families who I was with last night. We've been working, I'd say 3 years, but really 2. The first year, the Democrats were in power, and we did absolutely nothing to investigate the events of Afghanistan and what happened that day through the evacuation. After this is probably the most comprehensive investigation with the witnesses, the documents. It's an historic document. It's not a political document. It's very historic. I was a federal prosecutor. My lead investigator at USA and Afghan, we wrote this. And before you criticize it, read it. Everything is built on facts and evidence. And we made our case. We didn't draw conclusions in advance. We built the case all the way up. What we found was actually quite disturbing. We found that on day one, Joe Biden didn't care about the Doha agreement. I know a lot has been said about Doha and that President Trump entered into Doha, but that agreement had conditions placed in it. First of all, Taliban cannot attack U.S. forces, which they were doing. They cannot harbor or protect al-Qaeda, which they were doing. Al-Zawahiri being the prime example. Number 2 to bin Laden was protected by the Haqqani Taliban in Afghanistan. So when Secretary Pompeo briefed President Trump on that, he said they're in violation. We're going to keep our 2,500 troops, 6,500 NATO, with the blessing of NATO, our air cover, most importantly, and our contractors. And we are not going to abandon the Afghans. On day one, President Biden comes into office with a political agenda, a campaign promise built on a timeline. The timeline is to withdraw by the 20th anniversary of 9/11. Had nothing to do with policy, had nothing to do with national security, rather everything to do with a political timeline gimmick. And for those who say that Doha somehow factored into the president's thinking, I would just refer you to his spokesperson, who said Doha is immaterial to this evacuation. They were hell-bent to get out. It was called Go to Zero, and they did. Go to Zero meant all military, it meant all contractors, it meant all air cover and intelligence pulling out of Afghanistan, leaving the Afghan army defenseless. So what happens? The State Department is charged with the evacuation plan, but they didn't have a plan. They didn't have a plan until the day, they didn't initiate the plan until the day the Taliban actually took over Kabul. Think about that. On their way to the embassy. Ambassador Wilson, in charge of this, flees as a coward, runs to the airport, leaves his employees at the embassy, including the 100 Afghans who we promised we would protect, were left to the Taliban. Thousands of classified documents and passports burned, $7 billion in Bagram prison left behind. Most importantly, thousands of ISIS-K prisoners, the worst of the worst, released out of Bagram, which now impacts this country. They put the Taliban in charge. Can you imagine this? You've been fighting the Taliban for 20 years, and now your sworn enemy is your brother in arms. The Taliban is checking the checkpoints. All of the American citizens, the Afghan partners, and the women and children have to go through the Taliban first to decide if they can get through. Now, if you're an Afghan partner who fought against them, what are the odds the Taliban's going to let you through? We do know one thing. The Taliban let the suicide bomber from Bagram through the checkpoint to then kill 13 servicemen and women who we'll be honoring later today. But it didn't have to happen. But because there's no plan, there's chaos at the airport. The Taliban's there firing. Our Marines are thrown on the ground, undefended. And that fate, that time, that day, we knew the day and the time it was going to happen. And sure enough, boom. And 13 servicemen and women killed, 170 Afghans killed, 45 Afghan military personnel and American wounded. A massive suicide blast that didn't have to happen. So what are the ramifications of all this? First of all, we need to fix this so that if we ever have an evacuation like this again, this will never happen again. We had Saigon, we had this, but we have to get legislatively, and by the way, Mike Pompeo did open a crisis office that was tailored to this, that Biden shut down on day one, puts on hold. 2 weeks before the Taliban overrun Kabul, he shuts down the very office that was designed to help protect. We're going to bring that back in legislation. So where are we today? Well, when you project weakness, like Afghanistan, you invite aggression and conflict and war. It only took a month or two before the Russian Federation's moving into Ukraine. Chairman Xi and Putin are becoming allies, the Unholy Alliance. Xi is threatening Taiwan and the South Pacific, and they're tied to the Ayatollah in the Middle East. Ayatollah raising his ugly head with Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthi rebels threatening the Jewish people in Israel. It's not separated. It is all tied together. The three Unholy Alliance warriors, and I throw Kim Jong-un in there as well. So that is a state of play this president has put us in a moment of weakness across the globe, not strength. And then to end this whole scenario, this whole nightmare, when you take a failed foreign policy and connect it to a broken border policy, what do you get? When you've released thousands of ISIS-K from Bagram, who have gone up to the Khorasan region, Tajikistan, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, most dangerous part in their external operations. Khorasan equals external operations. Those are the ones coming through visa-free Nicaragua, through Mexico, into the United States. Don't take my word for it. The FBI briefed me. They've detained 8 of them. They got in, by the way, through the CBP-1 app, set up an interview, and were released into our society, later to be caught by the FBI. And a smuggling ring of 400. And God knows how many more are in this country, a ticking time bomb, a threat to the American people. So with that, I want to turn it over to our whip, Tom Emmer.